At the turn of the 20th century, America was a land of limitless possibility. The skyline rose with steel and ambition, bold, daring, and unstoppable. Fueled by the American dream, small-town entrepreneurs built companies that reshaped industries and uplifted their communities. Innovation became the heartbeat of our nation. In 1912, local business leaders united with a shared purpose: to create a single voice dedicated to defending free enterprise, empowering businesses to serve people, provide solutions, and strengthen society. That voice became the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, committed to advancing economic freedom and opportunity for every American. For over a century, we've been a driving force at the crossroads of progress, shattering barriers, fueling growth, and creating opportunities for people building better lives. We don't just support business, we ignite it. From local startups to global enterprises, we create an environment where potential thrives, empowering communities, leaders, and creators to transform bold ideas into lasting impact. Working with and for a local, national, and global federation of partners, we fight for American businesses in the courts, in state capitals, in Washington, and on the world stage. Steadfast in our principles, unwavering in our resolve, uncompromising in doing what's right. This is America's story, written with vision, bound by conviction, illustrated through courage, and enriched by the hard work of everyday people, local business owners, and global visionaries who continue to define us. It's an enduring legacy of strength, determination, and shared ambition, one we proudly build upon as we work to write the next chapter of our nation's story. Join us. Together, let's build a future of growth and opportunity for the pursuit.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Free Enterprise Exchange. For more than 113 years, the U.S. Chamber has been committed to defending, protecting, and advancing free enterprise. That's why we created this forum, to clear up common myths, explore emerging trends, and share timely insights that help us all champion and uphold the values of our free enterprise system. Today, we're taking a closer look at economic freedom across North America and what it means for growth and opportunity. We're pleased to be joined by Neil Bradley, the U.S. Chamber's Chief Policy Officer, and Matthew Mitchell, Senior Fellow at the Fraser Institute Center for Human Freedom. Matthew is a leading voice on economic freedom and public policy. Prior to joining the Fraser Institute, Matthew was a long-serving Senior Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where he remains an affiliated senior scholar. He has advised federal, state, and local government policymakers across the country in both fiscal and regulatory affairs. His research has been featured in numerous national media outlets, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and others. Today's discussion will unpack the findings of the Fraser Institute's 2025 Economic Freedom of North America report, which measures the degree to which citizens are permitted to take on their own economic choices across all Canadian provinces, United States, and Mexican states. Together, they will explore the impact of economic freedom in North America and how the data can be used by policymakers to inform the proliferation of pro-growth policy. You can find a link to the full report below in the YouTube description. If you'd like to pose a question during today's discussion, please click the Submit a Question button in the YouTube description. We'll first hear from Neil and Matthew, and then we'll get to audience questions at the end. Thank you for being part of this important discussion. Let me hand that over to Neil.
To measure things like economic freedom and what that means for an economy and for a society. But that's actually what you do every day. So we're excited to have you joining us and to dig into this conversation. Before we dig into some of that data and stuff, maybe you can start just telling us a little bit about the Fraser Institute and the work that you do.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad to hear that you all enjoy data. I do as well. Actually, that is the motto of the Fraser Institute is if it matters, measure it. So Fraser is the largest think tank in Canada. And we just had celebrated our 50th anniversary. And as a large portion of our sort of mission is to advance the idea of economic freedom and human freedom more generally. And to that end, we've been measuring economic freedom for nearly 30 years now. And I can get into the story of how we started doing it. But it is kind of an interesting idea of like, you've got this thing that we all think matters. How do we actually, is it ambitious, too ambitious to think that we could actually possibly put a number on it? But, I think our work suggests that you really can.
Well, I want to get to those numbers in a second, but maybe let's just start with when someone says economic freedom. When you say economic freedom, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so what we mean is that people have more economic freedom when they are allowed to make more of their own economic choices. So there's a couple of points here kind of to highlight. So one is, notice I didn't say when they are able to make more of their own economic choices. I would love to be able to buy a yacht. I can't do that, but I am allowed to do so. So economic freedom is sort of a social idea insofar as it has to do with what other people allow us to do. Are we permitted to do it? Another thing I'd like to point out is notice that I say the word more. It's a spectrum. So you can imagine places where people are allowed to make more of their own choices and other places where they're allowed to make fewer of their own choices. And you can also imagine that in some cases I might be allowed to make the choice, but it's a little bit more constrained, for example, through taxes or regulations that somehow limit my choice in some way. So with these two ideas, that it's about what others allow you to do, and it's a spectrum, we then kind of work from there, trying to design a way to actually measure economic freedom.
Am I right to assume that when you're looking at this, you look at it from both our economic actions, say as consumers, right? The right to your point to buy that yacht, but also our role as producers, the right to build the yacht. Are you looking at freedom from both of those things?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So, when we're talking about economic freedom, and by the way, other freedoms matter too. In fact, we'll soon be releasing another index called the Human Freedom Index, where we look at other human activities, association and speech and things like that. But when we're talking about economic activity, let's just sort of think about what that means, theoretically. An economic choice is a choice to exchange, to be able to exchange on your own terms, to be able to acquire and use productive property, to be able to contract with others, to be able to start a business and run a business, to be able to work. All of those types of things, sort of go into the idea of economic freedom. And when we measure it, we try as best we can to cover as many bases as possible to try to get at that.
Okay, so now we're measuring. We know we're gonna the framework of what we're into. What are the data points that you all look to as a way of measuring economic freedom?
Yeah, so first it might help to put it in context that the first index, the first way we began measuring economic freedom was at the international level. So we have the Economic Freedom of the World Index, which looks at 165 countries, uses 46 different data points to try to assess the degree of economic freedom in those countries. And there we're looking at things like the ability to start a business, how difficult is that, acquire property, taxes, spending, monetary policy, freedom to trade internationally, rule of law, those sorts of things. Then the index I think that we're going to talk most about today is trying to measure economic freedom at the state and provincial level in North America. And so with that one, we focus a little bit more squarely on spending and taxing. And then also a little bit, we dig into some regulations. We also, in order to try to we have a couple of versions of this. where we try to, in one version, we're trying to make it possible for people to compare states in the US to, say, provinces in Canada. And in that case, we take that international index data and sort of lay it on top of the local data so that we can try to get an apples to apples comparison. I think mostly in our conversation today, and usually when I talk to people from the US, I suggest we just use the subnational index because that's the best way to sort of compare between states.
Yeah, I think that's right. We're going to save a little time at the end. I do want to come back to how the U.S. is doing,
Yeah.
whether we're moving up or moving down, and what are the things that we could be doing better, and what are the things that we're doing well at. But let's, to your point, stick to kind of the state and provinces a second.
Okay.
Do you find when you're looking at kind of the subnational level, are there big differences amongst our 50 states, amongst the Canadian provinces? Does economic freedom really vary to any meaningful degree from place to place?
Yeah, it absolutely does. So one of the things, by the way, we've recently done is we added Puerto Rico. So when you account for Puerto Rico, that really has changed things. But even if you only look at the U.S. states, there's a huge difference, for example, between New Hampshire, which is the most economically free state, according to our measure, and New Mexico, which sadly is my home state. So, for example, just look at something like consumption spending. So how much does the government consume as a share of total state income? Well, in New Hampshire, that number is 11.9% of income, and in New Mexico, it's 28%. So there is actually quite a bit of variation across the states in terms of state level economic freedom.
So I want to come back to some of the comparisons, but I think it's important. I think you can help unpack for us a little bit. Okay, so New Mexico or New York, they spend a lot of money. Does that really impact my ability as a citizen in New Mexico or in New York, for example, to engage in economic activity? Help us understand that connection between the demand that government takes on resources and what that means from an economic freedom standpoint.
Yeah, that's a great question, especially because so many people view government spending as a positive, like, oh, great, the government's going to be spending more money in my state. Don't I want that? So there's a couple of reasons why that can actually end up limiting people's economic choices. So the first and the most obvious is that with more spending has to come more taxes. And so when governments tax more, they then are drawing resources out of the private sector. They're just on the margin, they're discouraging economic activity. One of the most important points in economics is if you tax something, you get less of it. And so when we tax income, that means we get less income. When we tax sales, we get less sales. When we tax property appreciation, people are discouraged from making sure that their properties take on more value. So the most direct way that government spending translates into a diminution in economic freedom is through that taxing angle. And remember, most states have balanced budget requirements or semi-balanced budget requirements. Many of them allow a little bit of fudging at the edges. But then the other way that it can affect it is when the government directs resources, that can crowd out private direction of resources. So, interestingly enough, for example, we find that governments that tend to spend more and have lower levels of economic freedom, there's actually less private charity in those places. So, as government takes on more and more responsibilities, sometimes the private sector can be crowded out and takes on less responsibilities. This also means that as government is getting more active, for example, in the labor market, it's having to compete away labor from the private sector. And that's fine if we think that the government can actually be more effective and be more productive with that labor. But it's a big problem if it's less productive than the private sector, and most of the evidence suggests that it is.
Is one way to think, if I'm thinking about an hour of my labor and an hour of my labor, someone wants to, let's say, purchase for $50, and that's what an hour of my labor. But if I'm in a high tax state, the return to me on my hour of labor might be a lot less than it is if I'm in a low tax state. So it's actually kind of robbing the return of the hour of labor that I'm delivering. Is that one way that they're kind of diminishing my freedom, the ability to earn to support myself and to support my family based on that hour of labor I'm providing?
Yes, I think that's a good way to think about it. So, remember, most people, as it turns out, think what economists call on the margin. So they think in terms of, does a little bit more effort along this margin or that margin make sense for me? So if you live in California where the top marginal income tax rate is 13.3%, and that's not even counting the federal rate, that is, means that a little bit extra hour of work where you're going to, let's say, earn $10, they're going to take 13% of that. Or let's imagine you're going to earn $100, they're going to take 13% of that. So that's, on the margin, that's pretty significant, especially when you compare to the fact that there are many states, I think about a dozen, that have zero marginal income tax rate.
Yeah. So you compile these rankings. You just mentioned New Mexico, I think is at 50, New Hampshire's number one. Do you find that states are pretty static, or have they moved up and down kind of over time? And if so, what are some of the choices that they're making that are making them either more or less economically free?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of both. So New Hampshire has long topped the list. They've been number one for several decades now. And New York has long been at the bottom of the list. I mentioned New Mexico finally displaced New York as the 50th state. California and Hawaii are often near the bottom. But there also have been significant movements. So just in the last 10 years worth of data, for example, South Carolina, Ohio, Wisconsin, Idaho, and Utah have all moved up at least 10 spots. Some of them to become some of the freest places actually in the United States. At the other end of the spectrum, Arizona, Virginia, Nebraska, and Maryland have all slid down 10 spots. So there is some movement over time. And essentially, it's kind of a combination of things. I recently did a report where I was looking at these major movers. And what I found was a big difference happened right after the Great Recession. So you can look at like 20 years worth of data to see what are the ones that move the most up or move the most down. And interestingly enough, most of that movement happened in the last 10 years. So and it happened across all the dimensions, labor market freedom, as well as spending and taxing. And one of the things that happens, of course, is that we'll get to this. Some of the consequences of economic freedom is that people tend to go to places that are more economically free. So once you kind of start sliding, if people are leaving the state, if businesses are leaving the state, that then tends to reduce the tax base. And then policymakers are sometimes struggling. What do we do? How do we still spend as much when we have a smaller tax base? And unfortunately, they can then turn to higher taxes as a way to make up for it. And so that kind of leads to this sort of vicious cycle where, diminution in economic freedom reduces the tax base, and then they further reduce economic freedom. And you can see a virtuous cycle going in the opposite direction for those states that tend to increase economic freedom over time.
Yeah, it turns out if people are moving there, they help support your tax base and lower the overall tax burden on each individual.
Right.
We talked taxes and spending a lot, but that's obviously not the only factor. You just mentioned labor market freedom. Tell us a little bit about what a free state or province looks like from a labor market perspective versus one that's less free.
Yeah, so one is they have lower minimum wage laws. Now, a minimum wage, this is somewhat controversial. People often, like minimum wages. They think this is a good thing because a higher minimum wage, well, doesn't that mean that those who are least well off among us can earn more? The problem is, as sort of basic econ teaches us, if you price people, if the minimum contractual wage that you're allowed to form is above what the market equilibrium will bear, you then tend to have unemployment. So if this is really important, especially if you are young or unskilled. So when I teach econ, I always put up a picture of myself at 18 and talk about my lack of the skill set at that point when I was a barista. And at that point, there probably were super productive baristas who could maybe make $20 an hour. I was not one of them. And if the government had imposed a $20 an hour minimum wage, that would have been a big problem for me because that really would have priced me out of the market. I just wasn't that productive. So one of the things that we do there when we look at a minimum wage is we don't just look at the rate that government set, but we look at the rate relative to per capita GDP. So what this does is it gives us a sense of what is the rate relative to the typical productivity in that state. And so, for example, we find that Wyoming tops the list in terms of minimum wage as a share of per capita GDP at 18.38, whereas at the other end of the spectrum is Arizona, which has a relatively high minimum wage, 46% of per capita GDP. So Arizona is, potentially pricing quite a few people out of its market. We also look at union density as sort of a proxy for limitations on people's ability to work free of union requirements. And then we also look at government employment as a share of total state employment. I should add here, though, this is an example where this is what we measure, and we hope to add more measures to this in coming years. There's some really great data sets out there that look at occupational licensing freedom, for example. And so we're talking about incorporating that into our index. We also are hoping to potentially incorporate barriers to entry. So how difficult is it to start a business? How much red tape do you have to go through? And this one is a little bit more ambitious because the data is harder to get a hold of, but we're looking to get a hold of data to allow us to measure land use regulation as well.
Yeah, which is a big driver of the housing shortage, right?
Yeah, exactly.
As the land use is regulated. Are there regulatory aspects of state policy today that are incorporated into the index beyond the labor side?
Not at the state level. At the state level, we do union density, government employment. We do minimum wage regulation. We do when we try to do that comparison so that you can see how does New Mexico compare with Alberta. In that instance, we do bring in some national level measures of regulation, and some of those do incorporate things like how difficult is it to start a business and how much red tape is there.
So we've gotten our hands a little bit around this idea of kind of what constitutes economic freedom and how to measure it. Is there actually a positive correlation between greater economic freedom and greater economic growth and prosperity? And in other words, it's nice to be free. That's important kind of in and of itself. But does it actually produce a difference in outcome for people?
Yes, it does. So this has been widely studied both at the international level as well as at the state level. So just take it at the state level for now. It turns out there's been over 250 studies. These are peer-reviewed academic studies that use our index of economic freedom in North America to assess the effect of economic freedom on outcomes that matter. But I should note, by the way, one of the things that's been really gratifying to see over time is that these indices, initially, as you might guess, were used by fans of economic freedom, people who thought that on the margin, more economic freedom is going to be better. Actually, we're now seeing a lot of skeptics of economic freedom use these to study their own variables of interest, and they're finding many of the same things. So what we find, the vast majority of these studies that look at economic freedom at the state level do indeed associate it with better outcomes. So you can see this just sort of in a simple analysis. If you look at the 25% freest US states, on average, they saw their populations grow 18 times faster over the last decade compared to the bottom 25%. Similarly, they saw their personal incomes grow 9 times faster than those in the bottom. But it's not just like average income that matters. In general, you can imagine with 250 studies, there's been a lot of things that have been looked at, but researchers find not only higher income, but more entrepreneurial activity in more economically free states, more net in migration, tends to be more income mobility. So in freer states and regions, people move up the economic ladder a little bit more. There tends to be more income growth at both the bottom and the top of the income distribution. There tends to be less poverty, less homelessness, less food insecurity. And then when you sort of look at sort of non-economic matters, that economic freedom is important as well. So people tend to be more philanthropic in economically free regions. They tend to be more tolerant of others, according to studies that measure the degree of tolerance, and they report that they are more satisfied with their lives. So really across the dimension, a lot of people, myself included, believe freedom and economic freedom is an end into it. Unto itself, right? It matters that people be allowed to write their own economic story, to start their own business, and to exchange with whomever they want on their own terms. But even if you don't buy into that, even if you are a skeptic of that, and you just care about something like poverty, which you should care about, or income mobility, which you should care about, it turns out that economic freedom is a really powerful tool to achieve those ends too.
Yeah, and it's remarkable. I'm so glad you alluded to this concept of civility and tolerance. It also turns out that when you're more economic prosperous, when you have more freedom to kind of choose your own path, you tend to be happier. There's great studies around the connection between economic growth, economic freedom, and happiness. There's something to this idea that people get to choose to do something that they like to do, and they're able to enjoy the fruits that go with doing that thing that they like to do. And so,
That's absolutely right. And what's interesting at the international level, there's so much more data, and you can add more controls. There's an interesting study that finds that the economic freedom and happiness relationship, as you might guess, with a lot of these things, it flows through income. So if you have more economic freedom, your income tends to be higher, and that tends to lead to more happiness. But what's interesting is if you do a little bit more sophisticated analyses, they find that it flows through income, but it also has a direct correlation as well. So people don't just seem to be happier because they're making more money. They're also happier because they're allowed to make more of their own economic choices. So again, that gets to this idea that it's both valuable as an instrument, but also sort of for its intrinsic value as well.
So I think we've established that economic freedom's a worthwhile thing to pursue. But that, of course, leads to the question of how do we pursue it? And one of our audience members picks up on a good question. You had talked about the changes in the rankings and kind of the movement in the post-pandemic. Are there trends? Obviously, that was an inflection point. It established some new trends. When you look going forward, are there trends that you're watching that are causing states and provinces to slip downward? And are there trends that the states and provinces that are improving are pursuing to move upwards?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a story where there's not one way to do it. Some places tend to focus a little bit more on spending restraint, and then that allows them to reduce taxes over the long run. Others seem to actually cut taxes first and then spending later. And then that flows into regulations. One of the things essentially that we find is that all of these different aspects of economic freedom seem to be interrelated. And you can see this sort of at the international level. At the international level, there are some that seem to be leading indicators. So, for example, trade freedom. There's a paper that suggests that trade freedom is a leading indicator of other aspects of international economic freedom. And we can really we're seeing this in real time right now. As US tariffs have gone up, we're now increasing spending to help farmers who are dealing with higher prices. There's now proposals and actually we're implementing it, where there's greater controls on international investment in the US. And some of this is being essentially transferred to the executive branch, has authority to, as we're striking these trade deals, the president is being able to direct exactly where those investments are going. So it undermines economic freedom down the line in other ways. So back. Sorry, that was a little bit of an aside, but going back to the state level, what I tend to see is that states often start by opening up labor market freedom, and then that often leads to reduced spending and tax cuts, but it can go kind of in any direction.
But it's interesting what you said, and you were talking about the national level, but I suspect it's true at the state provincial level, is that it's really hard to say we're going to be economically free here, here, and here, and choose not to be free on taxes or trade policy or labor policy. It's not, you kind of have to, you kind of either move towards freedom or you move away from freedom. And so that's a really interesting concept, because it defies the idea that, like, if you're at the bottom, well, just go do this one thing.
Right.
They
Yeah.
choose different places to start, but the reality is it's really hard to have a complex regulatory structure in your state and also not have high taxes.
That's right. I'm actually doing a new study now looking at the barriers to charitable giving. And interestingly enough, I find that those states that seem to have lower levels of economic freedom also tend to have more regulations that constrain charitable activity. So it's absolutely true that once the government starts, getting in one activity, it often tends to bleed over into other areas as well.
So when someone says, where do we start? Is your advice just start? Just pick a place and start moving?
Yeah, I think that's true, but I also think there needs to be, leadership really does matter here, and you have to be clear about what your end goal is. And so, you look at a place like North Carolina that has moved up quite a bit in the ranks in the last several decades. One of the things that they've done is they've not just set this goal of becoming more open to business and more economically free. They've also sort of enshrined institutional mechanisms that help them achieve that. So they have a good balanced budget requirement. They have a good tax and expenditure limitation rule. They've separated, this is kind of an obscure issue, but they've separated their taxing and spending committees in their legislature to make sure that the same committee isn't deciding both taxes and spending, because that tends to increase the demand for larger government. If you have more checks and balances where you separate those, we find that states spend less. So once you have this sort of commitment to it, that makes it much easier to then follow through. And it's especially great if it's a bipartisan commitment. If it's not just something that's seen as a partisan goal, this should be a goal for every party, honestly.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And sometimes it's easier to get the bipartisan commitment on some of these structural elements like you were describing. And so it turns out that structural institutional process things can also drive outcomes, but sometimes it's easier to get agreement on those structural aspects than it is that allow you to fight over the level of taxation or the level of spending. But deciding the right structure itself is an important thing to do.
That's right. Let me give you one other example, just sort of to help kind of illustrate what's possible. So at the beginning, early decade of the 20th century, British Columbia in Canada was facing a huge problem where they just were having a low entrepreneurship, low rates of capital formation. And they had a liberal government come in and identify eliminating red tape as a significant goal. And one of the things they did is they appointed a cabinet level minister of deregulation. So now everybody knows this is exactly what we're trying to do. The next thing they did is they ordered every single ministry to identify every piece of red tape that they required the public to comply with. Identify and count, what are you asking people to do? And then they set a goal of eliminating 30% of the rules, and they set essentially a better than balanced budget requirement for the rules, where they said if you are an agency and you want to propose a new rule, you have to eliminate 2. others that you already require people to comply with. So now you've got all this structure sort of aiming in the same direction, a high level goal. You've got a way to measure it, and people are all, incentivized to go move in that direction. And they ended up eliminating, I think the goal was one new regulation for every three. Well, they ended up, it was when they were moving really quickly, it was like a 1-to-4 ratio. And they, within a few years, they managed to sweep away more than 40% of all their rules that they were imposing. So with that kind of commitment, where you say, look, here's the problem. Everybody knows that this is a problem. Let's try to fix it. I think you can achieve something. And I'd note, in the United States, when it comes to red tape, honestly, the Democratic Party has a better record historically of eliminating red tape than the Republican Party. You just have to go back a while. It goes back to, Jimmy Carter days. Civil Aeronautics Board, surface transportation, railroad deregulation. Some of the most successful deregulatory efforts in U.S. history, and they happened under a Democrat's watch.
Yeah, I like to remind folks that in the 1970s, if you were getting on a plane, the federal government decided where that plane took off from, where it landed, and how much you pay for a ticket.
Exactly.
And it turned out that the difference is the federal government didn't regulate interstate flights. So if you were flying from Los Angeles to Sacramento, it turned out it was a much more pleasant flight and much cheaper than if you were flying an even shorter distance across a state line. And so
Right. And part of the reason we know that, by the way, is that Ted Kennedy highlighted that fact in some high-profile hearings in the Senate, and he was able to illustrate that these prices were the intrastate air travel was 50% as expensive as regulated interstate travel.
Yeah. So it turns out sometimes creating these choices, as you described in the Canadian province, of great, you want a new regulation, you want a new, let's say, paperwork requirement on people. Is it more or less important than the ones you currently have? Is a great way of forcing decision making. I want to get back to a couple of our audience questions, and I knew it was going to happen, and they got to it before I did. You began talking about the international comparisons. People want to know, how's North America doing these days?
Yeah. So one thing I should note is with these international data, we always end up being 2 years delayed because we, are relying on government. We have to be able to measure government spending and taxing, and then sometimes surveys, and so that does end up meaning that we can't always provide, a precise snapshot of what's going on right now. So the U.S. is doing okay. The top jurisdiction in the world internationally is Hong Kong, and it has been for a while. Singapore, New Zealand, Switzerland, and then the United States. But one of the things that we did in our latest report is we tried to get around a little bit of this 2-year lag to offer essentially a preview of how the trade war will affect U.S. economic freedom. And so in that instance, it's not so great. So, what we find is that the U.S., average tariff leaps up during 2025. It leapt up to the second highest tariff in the world. And it puts us, in the company of Saudi Arabia and Sudan and countries with very high tariff rates that you really don't want to be. And as you might guess, the highest tariffed countries in the world tend to have much lower income. So the 15 countries with the highest tariffs in the world, their per capita GDP is $9,700. Among those with the lowest tariffs, it's $43,000. So it's a big difference. But the other thing that we find is that, this increase in tariffs and tariff revenue then is going to push the United States down and actually threatens to push us out of the top 10 in terms of overall economic freedom. And that's not even counting the result that I was sharing earlier, which others have found that trade freedom tends to then promote other types of freedom. And the reverse is true. Restrictions on trade freedom tend to undermine other economic freedoms.
I think one of the things that a number of people predicted that was that if a country, in this case it was the United States, dramatically increased tariffs, that other countries would respond in kind. And the lessons drawn from Smoot-Hawley in the 1930s and kind of this race to raise tariffs. That actually hasn't happened this time. And I'm curious if you think that one of the reasons of that is that countries have a better understanding of tariffs' impact on their own economic freedom and therefore their own prosperity. Why haven't we seen this kind of I'll see your tariffs with an equal level of tariffs and a little bit more, and that kind of escalator, if you will?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there has been some of it, of course. China, for example, has responded in kind. But you're right, it's not as significant as one would think. And I think your explanation certainly makes sense to me, which is that, a tariff is a tax on yourself, on your own consumers. It's a tax on your own exporters. And it's sort of self-defeating, as the economist Henry George put it more than a century ago. We do to ourselves in trade wars what we do to our enemies in real wars, which is, in a trade war is just like a blockade around your own ports. And so I think there is sort of a better appreciation and understanding now than there was back in the 30s during Smoot-Hawley, that trade is mutually beneficial and that therefore restrictions on trade are mutually harmful. I think there's also a sense that this will pass. There's a sense, as U.S. tariffs have gyrated up and down, both as the Trump administration has gotten spooked by bond markets and essentially backed off, chickened out, or as courts have found the tariffs to be wanting in constitutional authorization, and we'll find out if the U.S. Supreme Court lets them stand soon. At least the tariffs that are authorized under IEEPA. But so as the policy has sort of gyrated back and forth, I do think that there is a bit of an international appreciation that this is not going to last too long, and maybe we can wait it out. At least that's what I'm hearing from other countries. Now, this still doesn't mean that it can't be terribly devastating. I work with colleagues in Canada, and U.S. represents more than 2/3 of Canadian trade. So it's just has an enormous impact on that country's ability to make their own economic decisions.
We have just a little bit of limited time left, so I want to go back to kind of the thesis of our discussion for a second and pick up one of our last audience questions that we'll have time to get to, which I think is a great way to frankly end on it, is that if you could spark a competition amongst states and provinces for economic freedom, what would that look like? In your way, like if it was a race to be the best, give us a little color of what that might look like.
Oh, that's great. Well, so I mean, I would say it does have to start with reducing tax rates, or at least it should start with thinking about reducing tax rates, and certainly across the board. But the top marginal tax rates in some U.S. jurisdictions are just eye-wateringly high, and especially by international comparisons, by the way. A lot of people don't appreciate that the United States has one of the more progressive tax codes in the world. The Scandinavian countries are not nearly as progressive in their tax regimes as is the United States. I would love to spark, a bit of that Jimmy Carter and Ted Kennedy excitement for deregulation, especially when you start to appreciate that a lot of regulations stand in the way of those who are, the most vulnerable. So you take something like occupational licensing regulation. It is ridiculous that states like Texas will spend lots of taxpayer money to train inmates to cut hair, and then those inmates leave prison and then are denied the ability to obtain a license to cut hair because they had previously been inmates. There's examples like that all around the country. Occupational licensure also, has a disproportionate effect on those for whom English is a second language, on military spouses. So it's one of those issues that I think both left and right should agree on. We mentioned the land use regulation. Here again, this is something that really it does benefit a small subset of the population, and that's those people who already have homes that are in single family, areas. But it's to the expense of anybody else who's trying to start a family. So YIMBY type regulations, that deregulation movements where we say, yes, we're going to permit some alternative types of housing with higher density, with mothers-in-law quarters, with those types of things. I think that's really helpful. Getting rid of regulations that prohibit people's ability to start businesses in their homes. I think that would be really beneficial. So yeah, I would love to see people excited, both from an economic and also really from a social perspective about liberating people and about permitting them to make more of their own personal and economic choices.
That is a wonderful economic freedom agenda to get started on. Unfortunately, there's actually lots that can be done, almost in every state on the list on all of those topics. Even if you're already, in the top 10, you could still be more economically free. And given what we've learned today about what that means for poverty, what that means for opportunity, what it means for individual happiness, more economic freedom ought to be at the top of everyone's agenda. Matt Mitchell of the Fraser Institute, I really want to thank you for the great work that you've done in helping us put data and metrics on economic freedom. That helps us identify what states and national governments can do to become more prosperous and free. And I'm grateful that you took a little bit of time today to help us unpack it and understand it.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a great conversation.
And to our audience, thanks for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed the Free Enterprise Exchange this year. I look forward to more episodes coming as we head into the new year. Thanks so much and happy holidays.